They always say the smallest choices can turn into the biggest storms. I never believed that, until the day a single essay twisted my life upside down. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever trusted someone only to learn the truth too late, then stay with me, because this story is mine, and it is not easy to tell. Before I go further, let me pause just a second. If you're here listening, your support means more than you know. A quick like or a comment, it's not just a button for me, it's your way of telling me that my voice matters, that these stories deserve to keep living, and for that, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. My name is Amelia. I'm 18 years old, the youngest in a loud, ordinary family that never really had time for my quiet habits. I've always lived in books more than in conversations. While my sisters went out, I stayed up late, filling notebooks with stories that no one ever read. Writing was the only place I felt like I existed. It all began on a gray Monday in senior English. Our teacher, Mr. Miller, had given us an open assignment: write an essay about anything that revealed who we really were. I poured myself into it, more than I'd ever done for school before. When I handed it in, my hands shook, as if I were surrendering a piece of my soul. When he returned the papers, he didn't just give mine back. He read it aloud, every word. My classmates shifted. Some rolled their eyes, but I sat frozen, feeling stripped bare and strangely powerful, all at once. When the bell rang, he stopped me at the door. His eyes lingered too long, his smile too knowing. "This," he said, tapping my pages, "is the kind of voice that can't be taught." In that moment, I thought he was offering me a gift, recognition, the kind I'd been starved for my whole life. What I didn't know was that he was also taking something from me, the safety of being just another girl in his classroom. And that's where it all started, the essay that should have been nothing more than a grade on a page, but instead became the first step into a storm I could never have imagined. After that day, nothing in class felt the same. Before, I had blended into the background, the quiet girl in the second row, hair tucked behind my ears, notebooks filled with words nobody wanted to hear. But now, I felt his eyes find me too often, lingering when they should have moved on. I tried to convince myself it was because of my essay, because maybe I really did have something rare. At first, it was small things. He called on me more than anyone else, praising my answers even when they weren't extraordinary. He started slipping my essays to the top of the pile when handing papers back, pausing for a moment, almost ceremoniously, before placing them on my desk. He never did that with anyone else. My classmates began to notice, though most just smirked or whispered that I was teacher's pet. At 17, I would have been embarrassed. At 18, I told myself this was my reward for finally being seen. Still, a strange unease pressed against my chest every time he leaned too close, every time his compliments grew heavier with meaning I couldn't quite name. Soon, the special treatment grew bolder. One day after class, he asked me to stay behind. My heart raced the way it does when you're about to be scolded, but instead, he said he wanted to give me extra reading. Writers should be challenged beyond their peers, he told me. He handed me a thin, well-worn book, its margins filled with his own cramped notes. I held it like it was holy, as if by touching the same pages I could absorb some of his brilliance. That evening, I read every word, including the scribbled lines in his handwriting. Some notes felt like instructions, others felt like confessions. I didn't know then that this was his way of pulling me closer, not through touch, but through words that blurred the line between teacher and student. From there, it became routine. Once or twice a week, he asked me to stay after class. Sometimes he gave me another book. Sometimes we just talked. About writing, about life, about how people misunderstand genius until it's too late. He spoke in a way that made me feel older, as if I weren't a high school girl at all, but his equal, and I let myself believe it. One afternoon, he told me that talent like mine was rare, that most students didn't deserve the kind of time he was giving me. His voice softened when he said it, as if he were revealing a secret meant only for me. My cheeks burned, but I couldn't decide if it was pride or shame, maybe both. At home, nobody noticed. My parents worked late, and when they did talk to me, it was only to remind me about chores or college applications. My sisters were busy with their own lives. So when Mr. Miller leaned across his desk and asked what I wrote about when no one was watching, I answered him honestly, because no one else had ever cared enough to ask. But here's the thing about being singled out. It feels like a gift until you realize it's also a cage. Every time he praised me in front of the class, my classmates looked at me differently, some jealous, some suspicious. I lost friends without even noticing. They stopped inviting me to sit with them at lunch. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need them, that my writing was worth more. But late at night, I lay awake wondering why my world felt smaller when it should have been expanding. He began asking me to share my drafts before anyone else saw them. "Trust me," he'd say, "you need honest feedback, not the empty clapping of people who don't understand." And I trusted him, because I wanted to believe he saw something in me no one else could. Still, cracks appeared. His compliments sometimes lingered too long, his eyes drifting to places they shouldn't. Once, when he stood behind me to read over my shoulder, his hand brushed my arm. The touch was quick, maybe accidental, but it set my skin on fire. I froze, pretending to keep writing, even as my thoughts scattered. Part of me wanted to pull away. Another part whispered that this was proof of how much he valued me. That's the dangerous thing about attention. It doesn't have to be pure to feel like oxygen. One day, he handed me an assignment no one else received. Write a short story that revealed something I'd never told anyone. Be brave, he urged. Show me the part of yourself you've always hidden. His voice was gentle, but there was a demand in it, a challenge I didn't dare refuse. I went home and stared at the page for hours. I wrote about loneliness, about feeling invisible, about how I longed for someone to choose me. When I gave it to him, my hands trembled again. He read it silently in front of me, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he placed the paper down slowly and looked straight into my eyes. "This," he whispered, "is why I believe in you." The words should have filled me with joy. Instead, they left me with a chill I couldn't explain. Looking back, I see the pattern so clearly. He wasn't just encouraging me. He was isolating me, binding me to him with every secret I spilled onto the page. He knew exactly what he was doing, and I was too young, too hungry for validation, to see it for what it was. But even then, in some corner of my mind, I sensed danger. Because the closer he pulled me, the more I realized I couldn't tell anyone else. His praise came with silence, with secrets I wasn't allowed to share. And secrets, as I would soon learn, have a way of turning into chains. I thought the secret meetings were proof that I was special. I didn't know they were just the beginning of something far darker. When the invitations to stay after class turned into something more regular, I convinced myself it was because I was special. That word kept echoing in my mind. Special. It carried a sweetness I couldn't resist. For the first time in my life, someone important saw me not as invisible Amelia from the back row, but as a voice worth listening to. It started innocently enough. At least that's what I told myself. He asked me to meet him in his classroom during free periods or after the final bell. The desks would be empty, the fluorescent lights humming, the faint smell of chalk dust clinging to the air. Sometimes he sat across from me, reading my work line by line. Other times he leaned against his desk, arms folded, looking at me with that searching gaze that made me feel as though he could read thoughts I hadn't even written down yet. He spoke to me like I wasn't a student, like I was a fellow writer. He asked what inspired me, what scared me, what I dreamed of. Questions that no one had ever cared enough to ask. When I answered, his eyes lit up, and I felt my words wrap around him like a spell. One afternoon, he pulled a chair close beside mine, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. He flipped through my notebook and stopped at a half-finished story I hadn't meant for him to see. "This," he said softly, "is raw. It's unpolished, but it's honest. Don't hide that from me." His voice carried an intimacy that made my stomach twist. Was this still about writing? or was it something else entirely? At home, I told no one. I couldn't. My parents barely asked about school, and my sisters were too busy with their own lives. If I mentioned it, they'd just tease me, accuse me of sucking up to a teacher. So I kept it locked inside, a secret between him and me. And the more secret it became, the more powerful it felt. Secrets can be intoxicating. They make you feel chosen, even when what's really happening is something much darker. Soon, the meetings moved beyond the classroom. Once, he asked if I wanted to walk the school grounds with him after hours, under the excuse of fresh air clears the mind. We strolled past the empty football field, the bleachers casting long shadows. He told me about his early career, about how he'd once dreamed of publishing a great novel, but had been swallowed up by teaching. His tone carried regret, and I found myself promising silently that I wouldn't end up the same way. Another time, he suggested I come to his office during lunch, away from the noise of the cafeteria. I sat in the worn leather chair opposite his desk, while he told me that true writers often had to sacrifice friendships, relationships, even family, to pursue their art. He looked directly at me when he said it, as if warning me to let go of everything else but him. And still, I let myself believe it was mentorship. I clung to the idea that he was helping me become something greater than myself, but there was a gnawing unease I couldn't shake. Each time I left his office, I felt both taller and smaller at once, taller because of his praise, smaller because of the silence I carried with me. Then came the day he gave me his personal phone number. "In case inspiration strikes at odd hours," he said with a half smile. My hands trembled as I saved it into my contacts. That night, staring at the glowing screen, I typed out a message thanking him for believing in me. His reply came instantly. "You don't realize how rare your voice is. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I read that line again and again until my eyes blurred. I should have felt proud. Instead, a chill slid down my spine. Why did it feel less like encouragement and more like possession? Still, the attention fed me. When you've grown up overlooked, any form of recognition can feel like love. And maybe that was what he was counting on, that I was too young, too hungry to know the difference. Weeks passed, and the meetings grew riskier. He started closing the door behind us. He lowered his voice when he spoke, as if we shared conspiracies instead of lessons. He told me I had to be careful who I trusted, because not everyone wanted me to succeed. People envy talent, he warned. They'll try to tear you down. But I won't let that happen. In that moment, he painted himself as my protector. But what I didn't see then was that he was also the danger I needed protection from. I began noticing how his stories about himself didn't always add up. He spoke of a wife, but only in passing, and never warmly. Sometimes he mentioned living alone. Sometimes he let slip details that contradicted each other. A photograph on his desk would appear one week, then disappear the next. A ring on his finger one day, bare skin the day after. These cracks in his image should have set off alarms. Instead, I filed them away, telling myself not to overthink. One evening, while we sat in the quiet classroom, he leaned closer than ever before. My notebook lay open between us, filled with scribbles about longing and escape. He tapped a line I'd written, "I wish someone would see me for who I really am." Then he whispered, "I see you." Those 3 words lodged in my chest like a blade. I wanted to believe him. I wanted so desperately to be seen. But at the same time, a part of me wondered, if he truly saw me, why did I feel so invisible everywhere else? I walked home that night with my heart pounding. I told myself it was excitement, that I was finally stepping into the life I'd dreamed of. But beneath that, deeper down, there was fear. Fear that I was stepping into something I couldn't step back from. The meetings became the center of my world. I stopped eating lunch with classmates. I stopped answering my sister's texts. I wrote late into the night, desperate to impress him, desperate to keep his attention. And the more I gave, the more he asked for. It was never enough. Looking back, I see that I was being drawn into a web he'd spun long before me. But at 18, with stars in my eyes and secrets in my pocket, I only knew that I felt chosen. And that's how the secret meetings began, not as guidance, not as mentorship, but as a slow tightening of invisible threads I wouldn't recognize until they had nearly strangled me. There is a rhythm to control that doesn't look like control at first. It sounds like praise one day and silence the next. It feels like a door held open for you on Monday and quietly closing in your face by Friday. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was the strange tide building between us, a tide that lifted me so high I could see forever, then dropped me fast enough to steal the air from my lungs. After the secret meetings began to feel ordinary, he changed the tempo. Some mornings he acted as if I were the sun. Every glance warmed, every comment confirmed that I was the most promising student he'd taught in years. I drifted through the halls with that heat on my skin as if success had a temperature. Then, without warning, cold set in. He barely looked my way. He focused on classmates who hardly wrote at all. He skipped my name when calling on volunteers. It seemed small, like nothing, but inside me, something panicked. I told myself to be patient, to work harder, to not need him so much. But the needing had already happened, and he knew it. On the days he froze me out, I pushed myself twice as hard. I stayed up later, drafting new pages with a kind of frantic devotion, desperate to earn back the warmth. My notebooks filled with versions of me I thought he would approve of, bolder, darker, more daring, more raw. I cut away the parts that seemed childish. I copied the tones he praised, even when they didn't feel like my own. Slowly, my writing became a mirror that reflected what I believed he wanted, not what my voice truly sounded like. That's the quiet part of the trap. When you're busy proving yourself worthy, you don't notice the shape you're bending into. Then came a week when everything was bright again. He lingered after class and asked about a new piece I'd mentioned. He nodded, thoughtful, as if weighing the future of literature in the tilt of his chin. He suggested I try a specific structure, something more transgressive, a word that felt too heavy in my 18-year-old mouth. He said if I pushed my boundaries, I might surprise myself. The way he framed it made me feel like refusing would be cowardly. So I pushed. I wrote a story that cut too close to the bone, and when I handed it over, my hands trembled at the edges until the paper rippled. He read it in front of me, eyes moving like blades. He praised a paragraph and dismissed a page. He circled a line and said it was the kind of truth that wins awards. I walked home on that praise, and for an evening I believed I had crossed into the world I'd been reaching for. The next day, he barely acknowledged me. I spent lunch in the restroom, staring at my reflection as if I might find the version of myself he liked tucked behind my eyes. It became a pattern. Push, then pull. Let me feel chosen, then remind me I was replaceable. Lift me up, then let me fall alone. And because I was young and hopeful and starving for approval, I kept reaching out every time he retreated, as if my reaching might stop the distance from growing. He started giving me tasks that sounded like opportunities. He asked for feedback on his lesson outlines, said my sense of pacing was intuitive. He hinted that some of his old drafts might benefit from a fresh eye. He placed a stack of printed pages on his desk with a casualness that felt rehearsed, then turned away as if testing whether I would prove useful without being directly asked. I stayed after school without being told to. I read every page, penciled suggestions in the margins, and left them where he'd find them. The next day, he smiled in that quiet, private way that made me feel I'd passed another trial. I didn't notice how the line between my work and his had blurred until the blur felt normal. When he wanted me close, he asked intimate questions under the pretense of craft. What did I fear most? What did I want from life? Which memories kept me awake? He said pain was the currency of real writing, and if I could name mine, I could control it on the page. I opened doors I hadn't opened for anyone else, and he stepped through them like a guest of honor. Later, when he needed distance, he switched to practical feedback, as if none of that confession had happened. The whiplash left me dizzy. Confide, detach, confide, detach. I started teaching myself not to need him emotionally. even as I built my days around the hope of being seen. He planted another seed during one of the warmer phases. He mentioned a competition and said my latest piece might be a contender. He made winning sound possible, not just in a magical way, but in a step-by-step way that implied he could guide me to it. For 3 days, I wrote like I had a deadline carved into my bones. On the 4th, he didn't bring it up. On the 5th, he told someone else in class that they should think about submitting work someday. The word someday landed like a lock clicking shut. I noticed how our conversations shifted depending on who was nearby. When the classroom door was open, he praised my discipline and told me to keep refining my drafts. When the door was closed, he praised my instinct, my bravery, my hunger. In the open, I was a hard worker. In private, I was exceptional. The difference felt like another secret. I held it like a gift and didn't ask why it had to be hidden. A few times, he let a look cross his face that I didn't have a name for. It wasn't a teacher's pride or a friend's affection. It was something heavier, something that made the air feel too thick to breathe. He stood too close when it happened slowly, like fog rolling across a field. At first, you barely notice it. Then one day you look up and realize you can't see where the horizon used to be. That's what it felt like, our roles dissolving into something hazy, undefined, and dangerous. The first shift was almost invisible. He stopped calling me Miss Carter in class, switching to just Amelia, his voice low and deliberate when he said it. To everyone else, it might have sounded like a teacher being informal. To me, it felt like the syllables were being held too long, as if my name had become something private between us. During one of our after-class sessions, he asked me to read aloud from my latest story. My hands shook as I spoke, the words fragile in the air. When I stumbled over a sentence, embarrassed, he leaned closer and whispered, "Don't apologize for honesty." The whisper brushed my skin, more intimate than the words themselves. Another time, while we sat side by side reviewing my draft, his hand rested on the desk just inches from mine. Too close, too deliberate. My pulse raced, but I didn't move away. Part of me froze in discomfort. Another part, hungrier, lonelier, interpreted it as connection. That duality became the new normal, fear tangled with desire, validation laced with unease. Soon, the line between teacher and something else blurred further. He began giving me writing prompts that felt more like confessions. "Write about longing," he said once. "Not the kind you admit to friends, but the kind you never say out loud." I went home and stared at a blank page for hours before finally pouring out words I'd never dared put into ink. When I gave it to him, I swore I saw something shift in his eyes. A hunger not for the story, but for the girl behind it. The next day, he called the class to attention, praised my writing in front of everyone, and yet the praise carried a different weight now. I felt exposed, as if he was speaking in code meant only for me. My classmates rolled their eyes, whispering behind my back, and I knew the gap between me and them had grown too wide to close. There was a night that stands out. He offered to drive me home after a late workshop. I hesitated, but it was raining, and the thought of walking in the storm made me say yes. In the car, the silence pressed against us heavier than the rain. At a stoplight, he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you know," he said softly, "how rare it is to feel truly understood?" My breath caught. I wanted to ask if he meant by me, but the words never left my mouth. When he dropped me off, his hand brushed mine as I reached for the door. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in my mind for days. At home, I lay awake, replaying every detail. Was it wrong? Was it right? Did it even matter? I told myself I was overthinking, that he was just kind, that my mind was twisting nothing into something. But the truth was, something had shifted, and pretending otherwise was just another kind of lie. His compliments grew sharper, more personal. He commented not just on my writing, but on my appearance, subtle at first, then unmistakable. "You have an old soul," he said once, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin prickle. "You don't carry yourself like the others." Another time, when I wore a simple dress for a presentation, he murmured. Elegant. Unexpected. The words should have been harmless, but wrapped in his tone, they became charged. The push and pull from before turned into something else entirely, an undercurrent pulling me into deeper waters. I stopped questioning the nature of it and started surrendering. I told myself I was mature enough to handle it, that I was in control. But control was slipping further away with every blurred line. Then came the night he asked me to write something for his eyes only. He told me to explore desire, to put into words the kind of yearning people bury deep inside. My heart pounded as I wrote, every sentence feeling like a confession, a dangerous unveiling. When I handed it to him, he read slowly, carefully, and when he looked up, his eyes held mine for too long. No teacher should look at a student like that. No student should feel proud of it. Yet I did, and I hated that pride almost as much as I craved it. That was the moment I knew the fog had swallowed us whole. There was no classroom anymore, no neat boundary of teacher and pupil. There was only a man and a girl caught in a web of secrets, each pretending it was about writing when both of us knew it wasn't. But here's the part I didn't understand then. Blurred lines never stay blurred forever. They sharpen eventually, and when they do, the picture is rarely kind. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it taps, a tiny, relentless tapping under the surface, like a watch ticking in a quiet room. That's how I first felt it in him, small, rhythmic, impossible to unhear once I noticed it. The same man who coached me to be bold began to flinch at invisible alarms, and the change told me more than any lesson he'd ever taught. It started with a schedule change. He had always been casual about our meetings, drifting into them like he had all the time in the world. Now he checked the clock, checked the hallway, checked his phone. The door that used to close with an easy, thoughtless click now hesitated on its hinges. He kept it cracked, then closed, then cracked again, as if he couldn't decide which version of himself he was trying to be. I saw it in the way his shoulders tightened when footsteps passed, in the way his voice flattened when someone knocked, in the way he placed a stack of essays over my pages, like a blanket over something that might draw attention. The rhythm changed. The old music of praise and silence made room for a new instrument, panic. One afternoon, the principal's email chime sounded from his laptop. He didn't open it while I was there. He minimized the window and switched to a blank document, pretending to type notes on my draft while the glow of unread messages pulsed like a heartbeat. I pretended not to notice, because pretending had become part of how I survived. But the air in the room felt different, thin and sharp, and I learned how fear smells when it mixes with paper and toner, like hot dust. Another day, a colleague stepped into the doorway with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked about a department meeting. He gave an answer that wasn't really an answer and angled his body to block her view of me. His tone was fine, friendly even, but something cold flickered behind it, and she lingered just a second too long before leaving. When she was gone, he rearranged the books on his desk, pointlessly, the way people do when their hands need to prove they're steady. I started collecting these changes the way I collect images for stories. The absent ring that reappeared, the framed photo that rotated out of sight, the sudden praise for other students in class, not generous praise but strategic, like sand thrown over fresh footprints. The more careful he became, the more I understood. I wasn't the only one living inside a secret. The clearest slip came during a parent night. He prided himself on these events, professional, polished, a figure of culture guiding young minds. I arrived late with my mother, who doesn't like crowds and dislikes pretension even more. He was mid-sentence when he spotted me at the back. His words stuttered. It was brief, barely a skipped beat to anyone else, but I felt it like a cold hand between my shoulder blades. He cleared his throat, recovered, and his smile reattached itself, but some part of me had already stepped out of the spell and was looking at him from the doorway of my doubt. Afterwards, parents clustered around his desk with questions. My mother stood apart, scanning the walls, taking in the quotes, the student essays pinned with colored tacks. She's not a reader of fiction, but she reads people. When he finally reached us, he praised my discipline in a tone that felt oddly formal, like he was reading from a script. He avoided specifics, dodged details, made my work sound flatter than it was. My mother's eyebrows rose. On the car ride home, she said that any adult who can't say a clear, clean sentence about a young person's strengths isn't looking closely at the right thing. She didn't know what I was caught in, but she knew something smelled off. The next week, he shifted into a new guardrail. He began talking about professionalism. He wrapped the word around us like a plastic cover, as if saying it enough times could protect him from the heat of his own actions. He emphasized boundaries in a way that felt performative, like a speech built for someone else's ears. When the classroom door was open, he mentioned deadlines and rubrics. When it was closed, he spoke in careful, polished phrases that touched everything and said nothing. His eyes still searched for me, but his sentences had learned to wear armor, and yet, the other rhythm continued. Praise in small doses, distance in larger ones. The push and pull hadn't disappeared, it had adapted. His fear didn't reduce the intensity, it redirected it. He became meticulous about calendars. He shortened meetings by a few minutes. He sent notes through school channels instead of text. He turned spontaneity into scheduling, as if control could drown out what control had created. That should have made me feel safer. It didn't. It made me feel like an accomplice to my own disappearance. Being hidden behind protocols is still being hidden. I found myself wondering about his life outside those walls. I had always pictured him as a man layered in solitude, a kitchen where the kettle always has water, a couch with the perfect reading dent, a desk lamp burning late over half-finished chapters. But the pictures I started to notice told a different story. The phone calls he declined with his jaw clenched, the quick straightening of papers when a name flashed across the screen, the faint groove on his finger where a ring sometimes was, sometimes wasn't. There was a day in the parking lot when the mask nearly fell off entirely. I had stayed late to reprint an essay. He was leaving at the same time, the sun giving everything that end-of-day amber that makes the world feel kind for a few minutes. A woman walked toward us fast, stopping just shy of the lamplight. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw the way his shoulders tightened, the way her hands opened and closed at her sides. He kept his voice even, she did not. When she left, he stood still for a long moment, staring at the pavement as if it might offer instructions. He didn't see me. I didn't call out. I learned something I couldn't yet name. No one can keep every part of a life in the air forever. What if questions began speaking up in my head? What if the colleague in the doorway asked another question at the wrong time? What if a parent noticed a pattern in awards and praise that traced back to closed doors? What if a rumor, true or not, found oxygen? What if the person behind that lamplight stepped into the building with a story? The future, which had sounded like promise in his voice, began sounding like risk in mine, and still, a quieter what if pushed through. What if I stepped away? What if I reclaimed the parts of my writing that had nothing to do with his approval? What if I chose a normal afternoon over a secret that kept making me smaller? That line of thought made my chest ache, because it meant acknowledging how far I'd wandered from myself. A small reversal happened without my planning it. I started timing our meetings the way he did. I arrived a minute late on purpose. I kept my backpack on my shoulder. I answered his precision with my own, not with defiance, but with a kind of measured presence. Here, but not devoted. Engaged, but not absorbable. I watched him register the change. A flicker of confusion he smoothed with a practiced smile. For the first time, I felt a sliver of control slide back into my palm. I also began to reread my early work, the essays I wrote before his voice moved into my head. They were messier, less polished, a little naive, but they were mine. My cadences returned to me like a song I used to hum without thinking. I kept those pages in a separate folder, paperclipped tight, a small archive of the girl who hadn't yet learned how to make herself disappear. His fear sharpened when the school announced a new plagiarism and ethics initiative. It was standard policy talk, emailed to everyone, presented in a bland slideshow. He sat rigid through the meeting, nodding at all the right places, the model of compliance. But afterwards he rushed back to his room and began rearranging files, renaming folders, scrubbing the timeline of things that had never been wrong on paper. That was the tell. Innocent people don't rewrite their own history at 3:30 p.m. on a Thursday because of a slideshow. A guidance counselor, warm, observant, stopped me in the hallway that week and asked if I was doing okay. I said yes. She watched my face a second longer than casual and handed me a flyer about balancing ambition with well-being. "Sometimes the best students forget to breathe," she said softly. I took the paper and felt tears I refused to let fall burn hot under my eyes. That single kindness made the contrast brutal. Care doesn't need a closed door. The more his edges frayed, the clearer his Achilles heel became. It wasn't me. It wasn't even the risk of discovery in the way I had first imagined it. It was his reputation, his carefully curated identity as a man of letters, a trusted mentor, a public adult who quoted great books and kept his posture straight. He could stomach risk in private. He could not survive shame in public. I saw it now like a map. Every careful email, every door half closed instead of fully shut, every strategic praise in full view. It was all architecture built around one fragile truth. He needed to be seen as good more than he needed to be good. That's when the tapping under the surface stopped sounding like a warning to me and started sounding like a metronome. If he lived by the beat of public approval, then public truth was the only language he could hear. Not scandal, not cruelty, truth, timed and undeniable. I wasn't ready for revenge, not yet, but I was ready for clarity. I began keeping cleaner records of my work, timestamps, drafts, the evolution of each piece. I moved my writing life back into daylight. Library tables, shared docs, witnesses to the hours I used to spend behind a closed door. I wasn't building a case. I was building a way back to myself. And quietly, that looked like power. One night, I lay awake and let a final what-if settle beside me. What if I stopped chasing the version of me he approved of and started standing in the version of me that could stand on her own? The thought was simple. It felt like opening a window. The next week, when he suggested a new exercise that sounded like another line I'd have to cross for the sake of the work, I didn't freeze. I saw the shape of the tide, the pull of it, the drag. I saw the shore too. If fear was his weakness, I was about to learn how to turn it into a mirror and make him watch himself in it. Power doesn't return with a shout. It slips back in with small choices, where I sit, what I keep, what I no longer give. After the mask slipped, I stopped believing in the spell of his approval. I started believing in paper trails, witnesses, and daylight. It wasn't anger that moved me first. It was clarity. I began by reclaiming my work. Every draft I wrote lived in 3 places: my notebook, a cloud folder with timestamps, and a printed copy signed by me with the date. I saved voice notes as I revised, whispering lines into my phone so the rhythm of my thoughts had a time-stamped heartbeat. I emailed myself PDFs of final versions because email servers keep exact clocks. Each step was small. Together they felt like armor. Next, I moved where I wrote. No more closed doors. I took my laptop to the library and the noisy cafeteria. I let classmates glance at my screen. I asked the librarian to stamp a slip when I printed things. I asked a friend to trade feedback in the open, not in a whisper. Nothing dramatic, just light, on purpose. He noticed. His smile thinned when he passed the library table. The tide was turning, and he could feel it. He tried a new tactic, nostalgia. He reminded me of our best work, the early pieces he'd hovered over, the private sessions he framed as sacred. I answered with polite distance and public calendars. If he wanted to check in, I replied through school channels and copied myself. If he suggested extra exercises, I thanked him and said I'd turn in drafts with the class. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain. I just stopped making myself available to be hidden. A small, crucial luck arrived in the form of a flyer on the bulletin board, a spring literary showcase, open mic, student readings, visiting alum, parents, teachers, the whole community. He had circled it for weeks in class, calling it a celebration of honest voices. He wanted the stage. He always had. I realized the showcase could be more than a date on the calendar. It could be a mirror. If his weakness was public reputation, then truth needed a microphone. I laid the groundwork quietly. I picked one piece to polish, one that traced the arc of being seen and erased and seen again. It wasn't a confession. It was a story about authorship, boundaries, and the way praise can feel like a leash if you're not careful. I made sure it was unmistakably mine, my images, my cadence, my early drafts attached to their digital footprints. I asked the librarian if she'd be willing to moderate the sign-up order for readings. She said yes with the kind of smile that says she's been waiting for students to ask her for years. I also checked the showcase rules. They were clear: original work only, plagiarism, zero tolerance, any claims of authorship must be backed by drafts upon request. It read like policy. To me, it read like oxygen. Then I did something I would have been too afraid to do months earlier. I started telling the truth, carefully, to the right people, not gossip, not scandal, truth as in facts lined up in a row. I told the librarian I'd been keeping thorough drafts and might need her help verifying them if questions came up. I told the guidance counselor I wanted to make sure my work was credited properly at the showcase and asked how best to submit materials. I looped in a student editor from the school lit mag, someone meticulous about process. Each conversation was simple, professional, and documented. The point wasn't to expose him. The point was to protect me. Protection, as it turned out, shines a light. He sensed it. He always sensed shifts in the weather. He praised other students more loudly in class, not generosity, but camouflage. He floated reminders about conduct and decorum in a way that sounded universal and felt pointed. He stopped closing the door entirely. He made sure colleagues overheard him giving neutral, buttoned-up feedback. The performance tightened. So did my resolve. What if questions sharpened into plans? What if I read first at the showcase, with my timestamps ready, my drafts printed in a neat folder? What if I also submitted my piece to the Lit Mag with a clear version history and shared doc permissions that logged every view? What if, after I read, the audience heard echoes in something he later presented as inspired teaching? What if I didn't accuse, but let the facts stand where everyone could see them? I didn't want a scene, I wanted a record. In the days before the showcase, I made one more change. I stopped feeding his need for secrecy. When he asked to touch base after school, I answered from my school email and offered a time during office hours with the classroom door propped. When he suggested more daring work, I asked him to put the assignment in writing so I could attach it to my draft folder. He obliged. He always did when professionalism had eyes on it, each receipt layered into a quiet fortress. I also took care of my heart, something I'd neglected for months. I went for walks without a notebook. I ate lunch with a girl from art class who laughed with her whole face. I slept. I read authors who sounded nothing like him and everything like possibility. I wrote a page that didn't try to impress anyone and kept it for myself. Midweek, I stood in the library with my folder and felt something I hadn't felt since before the fog. Steady. That's when I want to speak to you, the person still listening to me right now. If this story matters to you, if you want me to keep bringing the raw parts and the healing too, your simple like or a kind comment truly helps me more than you can imagine. It tells me I'm not alone up here, turning my voice into something useful. Thank you, for real. Back in class, he tried one last nudge. He floated the idea of co-authoring a short piece for the showcase, framed as a mentorship highlight. He used phrases like shared vision and collaborative growth. The words were clean, the offer was not. I replied that I'd be reading my own work, solo, and that I'd already submitted my drafts and outlined to the event coordinator per policy. He studied me as if I were a passage whose meaning he could still bend. When he finally nodded, it was the nod people give when they're moving pieces on a board you can't see. I let him think he still had a board. 2 days before the event, I visited the tech booth in the auditorium. I asked the student running sound if they could project simple slide titles behind each reader, just names and piece titles. The librarian approved it on the spot. It was nothing flashy. It was accountability. Name, title, authorship, on a screen 10 feet tall. He had lived in whispers. My plan lived in fonts and timestamps. I didn't tell my family much, just that I'd be reading. My mother said she'd come. I wanted her there, not to witness a takedown, but to see me as I was before any teacher shaped my voice. A girl with a page and a spine. The night before the showcase, I lined my materials on my desk, printed drafts, date-stamped emails, the submission confirmation from the Lit Mag, the outline with my initials and time codes, the librarian's sign-up sheet with my slot circled. It looked less like writing and more like scaffolding. That's what truth needs sometimes, not just beauty, but structure. And then I slept. Deeply. No racing pulse, no spinning what-ifs. I had done what I could do. The rest would be light and a microphone. On the day of the showcase, the auditorium smelled like dust and stage curtains. Students buzzed backstage, some fidgeting, some humming. He stood by the wings in a blazer that tried to look effortless. When his eyes found me, they slid past, then back again, as if recalibrating. I felt the old reflex, look for the smile, earn the nod. It flickered and died. I looked toward the librarian instead. She lifted a clipboard. My name was first. As the house lights dimmed, I stepped to the podium with my folder under my arm and my name glowing on the screen behind me, spelled correctly, large enough for the back row. My voice didn't shake. I read a story about boundaries and the cost of being chosen for the wrong reasons, about keeping receipts when someone insists your truth is just a feeling. I didn't name him. I didn't need to. The room knew what integrity sounded like. It's quiet, but it carries. When I finished, the applause felt like a wave. Not wild, not chaotic, just full. He stood in the wings, face composed. Composure is a fragile thing when the air itself is a record, because when it was his turn to take the stage, with a piece that bore my fingerprints, the light stopped being warm and started being evidence. Applause still echoed in my chest as I left the podium. My hands tingled from gripping the pages, my pulse steady in a way it hadn't been for months. For the first time, I felt the room see me, not through him, not filtered by anyone else's voice, but simply as mine. I slid back into my seat, folder closed, my name still glowing on the screen behind me for one more second before fading. Then it was his turn. He walked toward the stage with his usual measured confidence, blazer pressed, expression calm. To most of the audience, he looked like the same polished mentor they'd always known. But I noticed the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he adjusted the microphone stand twice, how his hand lingered too long on the papers he carried. I knew that kind of delay. It was the stall of someone who didn't want to step into the light. He began reading. The words were smooth, his delivery practiced. The audience leaned in, as they always did. But my stomach clenched with every line because I recognized them. They weren't exactly mine. He had changed phrases, adjusted rhythm, shifted the frame, but the bones were mine. Whole sentences lived in my drafts, pieces of me he'd lifted, sanded down, and polished to look like his. For a moment, I wondered if I was the only one who noticed. Then I caught the librarian's eyes from across the room. Her brow furrowed. The student editor from the Lit Mag glanced at me, then at the stage, then back at me again. The shift was quiet, subtle, but it spread through the rows like the ripple of a stone hitting water. Recognition. And then came the slides. Behind him, on the screen, his name and title appeared, just as it had for me. Only the title glowed familiar, the same as my draft's working file, a phrase unique to my pages. I knew because I had planted it there deliberately, a watermark disguised as a title. My pulse surged, not from fear, but from vindication. Murmurs rose, parents shifted in their seats. One of the visiting alumni tilted her head, whispering to the person beside her. I could almost hear the gears turning in the audience's mind. Hadn't they just heard something similar from the girl who read first? Hadn't the rhythm of those words already been spoken into the air? His voice faltered for the first time. Barely, but it was there. A stumble on a word he'd said 100 times in rehearsal. He cleared his throat, forced a smile, tried to continue, but the air in the room had changed. The warmth had cooled into scrutiny. When he finished, the applause was polite, restrained, thin compared to the wave I'd felt minutes earlier. He stepped down from the stage, face neutral, but his eyes darted. He scanned the crowd for reassurance and found none. Then the librarian stood. Clipboard in hand, she announced a short intermission before the next set of readers. People rose, buzzing in low voices. Some glanced at me, some at him, a few at both of us, connecting invisible dots. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. During the break, the student editor approached me quietly. "Your draft titles," she whispered. "They match what he just read." I nodded, my folder still on my lap. She didn't ask for proof. She knew I had it. The trust in her eyes felt heavier than any accusation. I looked over at him. He stood near the wings, talking too quickly to a colleague, his hands moving as if he could rearrange reality by force. His colleague's face was unreadable, polite, but cool. That's when I saw it clearly. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, impossible to stitch back together once the threads were pulled. For months, I had been the one shrinking under scrutiny, doubting myself, hiding in shadows. Now the light wasn't on me anymore. It was on him, and light has no mercy when the truth finally steps into it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The silence around his name spoke louder than anything I could have said, and when the questions began, the ones whispered, the ones recorded, the ones he couldn't answer, the mask he wore cracked for good. The questions started small, the way cracks begin in glass. Someone asked him if his piece would be published anywhere. Another wondered aloud why the title sounded so familiar. A parent leaned over to whisper, but the whisper wasn't as soft as they thought. Didn't that girl already say something like this? By the end of the showcase, the air hummed with suspicion. He smiled through it, of course. That was his specialty, composure. He shook hands, thanked people for attending, even offered polite praise to students who'd stumbled over their lines. But the tightness around his mouth betrayed him. His smile looked like a mask slipping on wet skin. I sat near the back, folder clutched in my lap. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The work had spoken for me, louder than any confrontation ever could. Still, my heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Something irreversible had begun, and I could feel the edges of it sharpening. After the event, the librarian approached him. I couldn't hear her words, but I watched his reaction, the quick lift of his chin, the defensive squaring of his shoulders, the impatient flick of his hand toward the exit. She stood steady, her expression calm but firm. A colleague joined her, then another. The cluster around him grew while he tried to keep his voice low. The effort made him look smaller, not larger. By the next morning, the questions weren't whispers anymore. Students compared notes. Some remembered the prompts he'd given me, write about longing, write about secrets, and recognized fragments of those same exercises in his showcase piece. The student editor asked to see my drafts. I handed over the folder, calm as stone. Each page carried dates, revisions, voice notes, receipts. Word spread faster than I expected. In the cafeteria, someone said loudly, "She read it first." Heads turned. Eyes followed him in the hallways, not with admiration now, but with doubt. That doubt was poison to him. His authority had always rested on reputation, respect, dignity, the polished veneer of a man above reproach. And now that veneer was peeling in public. He cornered me after class. His voice was sharp but quiet, the kind of whisper that cuts more than it hides. He accused me of misunderstanding, of twisting things, of letting envy cloud my judgment. I listened without flinching. When he paused, waiting for me to fold, I simply said, "The drafts are dated. They speak for themselves." For the first time, I saw his composure truly fracture. His face flushed, his eyes darted. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had no script for this moment, no elegant phrase, no disarming charm, just silence. And silence was louder than any accusation. The unraveling accelerated. Parents called the school. Colleagues whispered in the staff lounge. The librarian filed a formal report, attaching student testimonies and copies of my drafts. The guidance counselor checked in with me, offering support I hadn't realized I needed until the weight of her concern landed gently on my shoulders. And him? He shrank. The man who once filled every room with authority now walked quickly, avoiding eye contact. His once confident stride turned into something closer to retreat. Students no longer lingered after class for his advice. Parents no longer smiled warmly at conferences. His name, once spoken with respect, now carried an edge of suspicion. The breaking point came during a department meeting. I wasn't there, but word traveled fast. Questions asked, documents compared, timelines laid out, my story against his performance, truth against Polish. He tried to defend himself, but every explanation collapsed under the weight of proof. By the end of the meeting, he was asked to take leave while the investigation continued. I heard about it that afternoon from a classmate who whispered the news with wide eyes. My stomach twisted, not with guilt, not even with triumph, but with something simpler. Release. The secret I'd carried, the silence that had chained me, wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the open air, where it could breathe and grow roots. That night, I sat at my desk and reread my earliest stories, the ones I'd written before he ever noticed me. They were rough, clumsy in places, full of childish longing, but they were honest. They were mine. For the first time in months, I felt the thread of myself again, unbroken. He had built his power on silence, on blurred lines, on secrets too heavy for a girl my age to carry. But silence cracked. Lines sharpened, secrets surfaced, and the man who once looked untouchable was now nothing more than a figure hunched under the weight of his own unraveling. And when his fall became public, when the community saw the truth he'd tried to bury, his power didn't just vanish, it turned into humiliation he could never escape. The news didn't explode in fireworks. It spread like smoke, curling through hallways, seeping into emails, carried in half-finished sentences and glances exchanged over coffee cups. That's how reputations usually collapse, not with one loud bang, but with a steady suffocation of air. By the end of the week, the entire school knew. Parents whispered in the parking lot, their voices sharp and disbelieving. Students gathered in clusters, replaying the showcase like a crime scene, pointing out the overlaps between his words and mine. Teachers avoided his office, their smiles polite but their eyes wary. He was no longer the mentor, the guide, the figure of quiet authority. He was a man under suspicion, every step watched. The administration announced he would be temporarily relieved of duties pending review. Formal words for what everyone already knew: he was finished. He didn't show up that Monday. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been. At home, my family finally noticed me. My mother asked if I was okay, her eyes soft, her voice trembling with something like regret. My sisters teased me less, watching me with a kind of hesitant respect. For once, I wasn't invisible. My words had weight, and they had changed something bigger than me. But the fallout wasn't just his, it was mine too. I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I didn't carry his secret anymore. He couldn't hide behind my silence. He couldn't pretend my voice belonged to him. But heavier because exposure always comes with a cost. Some classmates whispered that I'd exaggerated, that maybe I'd wanted the attention. Others avoided me altogether, unsure how to treat a girl who had dared to bring down a teacher. Still, I held my ground. I had my drafts, my timestamps, my folder thick with proof, and more than that, I had my voice again. I began writing not just for him, not just for the stage, but for me. Pages that no one else would see, words that didn't need applause to matter. As for him, his fall deepened each day. Rumors surfaced of other students who had felt the same strange closeness, the same blurred lines. Parents demanded answers. Donors pulled funding from programs he had overseen. His carefully curated persona, mentor, intellectual, protector of young talent, crumbled under scrutiny. I heard from a classmate that he tried to explain it away, saying he had only wanted to inspire, that his closeness had been misunderstood. But no one believed him anymore. The calm authority in his voice no longer sounded like wisdom. It sounded like cover. His words had lost their weight. The humiliation was public. He had lived for praise, for reputation, for the admiration of students and colleagues. Losing that wasn't just a setback. It was annihilation. The man who once stood tall at the front of the classroom now shrank into a shadow, his name spoken only in hushed tones, laced with doubt and pity. And the irony? He had always told me that writing was about honesty, about digging into truths too raw to hide. In the end, it was the truth that buried him. I didn't gloat. I didn't need revenge in the form of cruelty. The justice was in the balance being restored, in the silence finally breaking, in everyone seeing what I had seen all along. But the fallout wasn't just about him losing. It was about me winning something I hadn't realized I was missing, the ability to trust my own perspective. For months, I had doubted myself, twisted reality until it fit the shape he wanted. Now, I knew better. The drafts weren't just evidence. They were reminders, proof that my voice existed, always had, and always would, no matter who tried to claim it. He lost his reputation. I regained my own reflection. And as he crumbled into silence, I stepped into the light, not as his student, not as his creation, but as myself, finally whole. The silence he left behind didn't feel empty. It felt like space, like air rushing into a room that had been locked too long. For months, my voice had echoed inside the narrow walls of his approval. Now, for the first time, it stretched into something bigger. The school moved forward without him. Another teacher stepped in, gentle and professional, someone who treated writing like a craft instead of a secret. The classroom felt brighter, lighter. No more closed doors, no more hidden glances, no more walking on eggshells. Students who had once been overlooked were suddenly encouraged. I watched their faces light up when their words were celebrated openly, without strings attached. It made me realize how warped my own idea of praise had become. At home, the shift was quieter but just as real. My mother began asking about my stories, not just whether I'd done my homework, but what I was writing about. She listened, really listened, nodding, sometimes even smiling. My sisters rolled their eyes less and leaned in more. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. They saw me, not as a problem to fix or a background noise to ignore, but as a girl who had survived something and come out stronger. I started writing again with a kind of freedom I'd almost forgotten. My pages no longer bent themselves into his expectations. The sentences came out rougher, truer. Some days I wrote about the storm I'd just walked through, the blurred lines, the silence, the fear. Other days I wrote about hope, about futures not yet formed, about girls who learn to stand tall even when the world tells them to shrink. Every page felt like a step back into myself. And then came the invitation. The librarian, who had been by my side through all of it, asked if I would help lead a Saturday writing workshop at the library. Just for a handful of younger students, kids who wanted a place to share their stories. At first, I hesitated. Who was I to teach anyone? But then I thought about the girl I had been just a year earlier, desperate for someone to say my words mattered. If I could be that voice for even one other student, maybe that was enough. The first Saturday, 6 kids showed up. They sat in a circle with notebooks too big for their laps, pencils chewed, eyes wide with nerves. I told them the truth. Writing isn't about being perfect. It's about being brave enough to put yourself on the page. They scribbled, shared, laughed, stumbled. I listened, I encouraged. And when I went home that night, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with flattery or control. It was the warmth of honesty, of building something good out of something broken. I realized then that my story wasn't just about his downfall. It was about my becoming. I wasn't the quiet girl in the back row anymore, hiding behind her notebook. I was Amelia, writer, survivor, teacher in my own right. My voice had been twisted, nearly stolen, almost silenced, but in the end, it was louder than ever. I sometimes still think about him, not with longing, not with fear, but with clarity. He built his world on control, and when that control slipped, everything else fell with it. I built mine on truth, shaky as it sometimes felt, and that truth carried me through. His name will fade from memory, tucked away in whispers and warnings. Mine, I've decided, will stay on the page, because the lesson I carry now is simple. When someone tries to take your voice, the best revenge is to use it louder, clearer, and forever. When I look back now, the story doesn't feel like his anymore. It feels like mine. For so long, he made me believe that my words were only valuable when filtered through him, when carried in his voice. But the truth is simpler. My words were mine from the beginning. They always were. His downfall wasn't loud. It didn't end in handcuffs or newspaper headlines. It ended in something quieter, but sharper, people finally seeing him for who he really was. His reputation, the thing he guarded like treasure, slipped through his fingers, and there was no way to get it back. For me, the ending was different. I didn't just survive. I changed. I grew stronger, braver, louder. I learned that silence feeds secrets, and secrets are where abusers hide. Once I stopped being silent, once I trusted my own perspective, the balance of power shifted. He shrank, and I rose. That's the heart of this story. Injustice may begin in whispers, but justice finds its voice. So here's the simple moral I carry with me. When someone abuses your trust, life always finds a way to return balance. And when they try to silence you, the best revenge is to speak so clearly that the world cannot look away. To you, listening right now, I want to thank you. Truly. Every like, every comment, every small gesture of support means more than I can put into words. It tells me that my voice matters, that these stories reach someone out there who maybe needs to hear them. Subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. So if this journey moved you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or if it made you think about the power of truth, I'd love if you left a quick comment or tapped that like button. Not just for me, but for the message. Voices deserve to be heard. And as I close this chapter, I leave you with this. Never let anyone convince you that your story belongs to them. Because in the end, the truth always writes its way home.